You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Earlier today, I ordered American forces to strike Iraq.
All through the 90s, there was considerable attention on Saddam Hussein and Iraq, and there were numerous strikes, usually using Tomahawk missiles. These are missiles fired from U.S. naval ships.
Our missiles sent the following message to Saddam Hussein. When you abuse your own people or threaten your neighbors, you must pay a price.
And it starts out in Bill Clinton's first year. So previously, right before he became president, Bush had ordered a strike against Saddam Hussein for violation of sanctions. And then in June, Bill Clinton will order his own strike. And the reason was, in effect, to show that he had his predecessors back. After U.S. intelligence concluded that Saddam Hussein had plotted to assassinate former President George H.W. Bush. Bush had been on a visit to Kuwait in April 1993. Under the claim of self-defense, Clinton authorized the launch of 23 Tomahawk cruise missiles from Navy ships in the Persian Gulf, targeting Iraq Intelligence Service headquarters in Baghdad. Before the strike, Clinton calls Bush to inform him of the action. Bush expressed polite acknowledgement, but avoided any public praise. The Clinton administration, at least to hear the account of George Stephanopoulos, press officer in the early going in the administration, they would have appreciated a bit more from Bush. Some accounts suggest he was uneasy about the political optics of a military action framed as defending his honor. According to aides, off the record, Bush worried that if he embraced the strike, if he said thank you, President Clinton, or if he issued any public statement, it might make it seem that he had pressured Clinton into it. There's an additional problem. It's 1993, and we don't have the kind of technology then that you have now. And at first, the administration's not clear if anything happened from the strike, if the missiles hit the target. Here's from Rights vs. Public Safety, Military Secrets in the First Amendment, C. Robert Zelnick. Secretary Aspin calls General Colin Powell at the Pentagon. Could the Tomahawks possibly have missed? Not all of them. In desperation, presidential assistant David Gergen calls Tom Johnson, the president of CNN News. Gergen informed Johnson about the launch and asked him to check with his man in Baghdad. Johnson bent his policy to the extent of appraising the White House, what CNN was going to report. Johnson had just received reports that missiles were striking the outskirts of Baghdad, some hitting the intelligence facility. 4 of the missiles had missed their target, and the other 16, carrying a combined total of 8 tons of high explosives, destroyed the headquarters wing of the facility. In Baghdad, crowds of demonstrators demanded a repayment in blood. Clinton, pay attention, the crowd chanted. We are the people who toppled Bush.
There it is, the New Year's Eve ball in Times Square, the Big Apple, New York City, USA. We are live as we ring in the new year and the new decade.
Imagine this happens. You call an Uber, and you get in. And then you realize that the guy driving, he says, hello, and how are you today? And you realize that the guy driving, his voice is so familiar. What is it? What isn't? You realize it's the America Online guy. The guy from You've Got Mail. And this is what happens to Brandy Barker, who actually is working for Clinton campaign in 2016, calls an Uber. She's in Ohio. She discovers that the man driving her rideshare is Elwood Edwards, the famous voice She asks him to repeat the sound. He does. It's all very, to repeat the message. It's all very nice. In fact, Elwood's story is kind of funny. He's retired at this point in 2016, driving an Uber, and it turns out, for all of that fame, for how many times his voice was played, he records that in 1989 and is paid just $200 for it. Yeah, he makes more in a couple days driving his Uber retired than he does. It's not a sad story because Edwards worked in radio. He worked for TV in the Cleveland area for a little while, and he even sold sound files of his messages, personalized sound files, so you could get like, "You've got mail, Karen," and he had it. I see his website still on the Wayback Machine, where he's offering for sale for say $15 or $30. He would record you a wave file personalized. Now you got to remember, actually Edward's voice is more than just the mail ping. He would also be used when you signed off America Online, and you'd say goodbye. That's him. And also, "You've got files." So things like this. And you could get all of them personalized for $30 or other messages for various prices. So he did, make a little money off his fame, but not from AOL and not for every time that you listen to his voice. Sadly, Edwards did pass away in 2024, and he was 74. The 90s were something else, and that's why it deserves even more 90s ephemera. We did that episode. It was very popular, so I just wanted to do more. And why don't we start with how did the 1990s begin? The very New Year's Day. And in one city, it began with an explosion, in another rain, in another gunfire. Also canceled parades and protests. In New York City, the Times Square ball drop went forward despite rain. Police deployed 2,700 officers. New York City always does this big to manage crowds that were expected, but the crowds were smaller. And I could tell you this is where yours truly actually enters the story, because I was there in 1990. I did not see that ball drop because of that rain. I don't think it was as bad, if I remember, but it wasn't pleasant to wait there a long time. You got to remember, it's the beginning of a new year and the beginning of a decade. Boston has fireworks. In Los Angeles, people took the celebration into their own hands, and the new year was greeted by widespread celebratory gunfire, a long-standing and dangerous tradition. Officers likened the sound to a shooting gallery and warned that, hey guys, bullets that you shoot up in the air are eventually going to come down and cause injuries or deaths later. Luckily, at midnight, there were no injuries, but in the past, they would get the hospital records and see that casualties would show up later. In Pasadena, California, people were camped out over the 5-mile route of the Tournament of Roses parade, ordering pizza, cheering on sidewalks in anticipation of New Year's Day festivities. The parade's a big deal. 60 floats, 22 bands, 275 equestrians, and Senator John Glenn that year, the first astronaut to orbit the Earth, served as the Grand Marshal. But about 30 minutes into the parade, something else happens. It's briefly disrupted when AIDS activists rush the route, sit down, and unfurl banners right in the middle of the parade to protest what they saw as inadequate government action on the epidemic. Police removed these and arrested the demonstrators. But they got their message. The Rose Parade is a target because it's one of the most watched and symbolically all-American broadcasts in the country. And AIDS ACT UP at this time is starting to get attention in a way that just being nice and arguing for more AIDS research, wasn't. And you're going to see drugs get approved faster. There's more spending. There's more interest in solving the AIDS problem because of what these activists did. So, parade momentarily disrupted, but perhaps for a good cause. In San Francisco, fires. tore through residential buildings, in apartment buildings, powerful enough to collapse walls, blow out windows, ignite intense fires. One of the most widely reported incidents involved an apartment building where accumulated gas ignited, producing a force that resembled a bomb. They think initially this could be some kind of terrorist act. Now, this is 1990, before 9/11, but you did have events like the Lockerbie, Scotland, the Pan Am flight, and things like that. So there's still reasons to consider it, but they quickly find out that it's merely really bad infrastructure and gas leaks going on. The incident will become part of conversation during this decade about America's crumbling infrastructure, one we still talk about today. And that you have, in 1990, cities that are still populated but don't have budgets to fix themselves up. In Philadelphia, the annual New Year's Mummers Day parade was canceled because of the rain. This is the parade where the men will dress up in costumes, very flowery, very colorful, very big, and play their banjos. Very Philadelphia thing. And it's postponed till January 6th because of high winds and snow. At midnight, crowds gathered at the Space Needle in Seattle. It was lit up with 6,500 bulbs to welcome in the new decade. And in Houston, a 20-foot Lone Star rose to the top of the Texas Commerce Tower amid fireworks and music. In Atlanta, a massive foam and fiberglass peach descended over Georgia landmarks. Together, these moments captured a New Year's transition. I can recall myself, I do recall this day very well, probably up all night. I was with my brother who was studying art school at Cooper's Union at the time. And in Astor Place in New York City, there's this big statue of a cube. And some people know and some people don't, that if you get enough people, you can turn this cube statue and it rotates. And we got a bunch of people and did that. And so we had left the formal celebration of the ball dropping that would have been crowds and people, and we went to a much more spontaneous and smaller event of a bunch of people turning around the cube. And I just have to say, not to sadden the mood or anything, but that my brother did pass away in 2024. And so I do remember that event well. We turned around that cube several times, had a lot of fun. There was a band that was kind of like a punky band of Cooper Union folks that just did the New Year at 1:00 a.m. They just kind of rescheduled it and did their Happy New Year at 1, and a whole bunch of people came for the 1:00 party. It's a very artsy thing to do, I thought, just like playing games with time. And here's what a newspaper says about January 1st, 1990. It's 8:30 a.m. as you pick up today's newspaper. The new decade is already 30,600 seconds old. That means there are only 315,502,200 seconds left until the year 2000. In those seconds, we will eat, sleep, work, and recreate. Some of us will exercise. All of us will grow older. An unsettling percentage of what will happen to us cannot be predicted, this newspaper says in 1990, but there are a few things we can depend on. As we said, there'll be 315 million seconds, and there'll be 2 leap years in 1992 and 96. The average television viewer will watch 25,659 hours of TV. That's 1,069 days, or 2.9 years of watching TV. Almost 6 months of deodorant and used car commercials will be aired. Welcome to 1990. Another thing that would happen in this decade that they were already warning about, the whole decade would have 17 Friday the 13ths. But in one year, there is going to be a year with 3 Friday the 13ths in it. That would be 1998. It's odd, because most years would only have 1 and some 2. Since they warned us 8 years early, there is plenty of time for those that have triskaidekaphobia, fear of the number 13. You pull your car to a stop at what looks unmistakably like the bottom of a hill. The trees lean upward. The road ahead appears to rise. The horizon tilts just enough to lock that impression in place. You shift into neutral then. Lift your foot off the brake, and the car begins to roll up the hill without any engine power at all. This is what happens in a series of places across the United States. It still happens. But it culminates the 1990s into a term called gravity hills. And you start to see the first newspaper coverage of it and noticing it as a cultural phenomenon in various places. Louisbury, Pennsylvania, Pleasant View Road and Windermere Road feels ordinary until you go with your car there and try it. Traffic moves quickly through the area, the road's unmarked, and nothing signals that you're standing on what might be a roadside curiosity. Yet if you put the car in neutral, the illusion is among the strongest anywhere in Pennsylvania. There are several of them in Pennsylvania, these gravity hills. In fact, they say the Louisbury one is a little bit different. It's harder to visually solve. There are accidents at this intersection in Louisbury, Pennsylvania over the years, including serious ones. And residents who rode school buses through it still remember the hill as generally dangerous in bad weather. So the reality of having a bad intersection along with this gravity hill phenomenon adds fuel to the fire, and there are, of course, ghost stories. And there's legends of children who push cars uphill magically. An article in the Ventura County Star in 1990 centers on Fillmore, California's Gravity Hill along Tolland Road near the local landfill, where drivers deliberately stop their cars, put them in neutral, and watch them roll in a direction that appears unmistakably uphill. In the story, they describe repeat visitors, including local residents who bring friends out specifically to demonstrate the effect. One man recounts riding along while his wife screams, "The car is moving the wrong way," while another says he tested it repeatedly because he couldn't accept what his eyes were telling him. In the fall of 1990, Spook Hill in Lake Wales, Florida, gets national attention on the CBS Morning News, introduced by Charles Osgood, which brings this gravity hill into living rooms nationwide. What had been a local curiosity now becomes a shared national reference point. It's not something that just happens to one person, though people can have a little bit of a different effect around these so-called gravity hills. Now, what's going on? Well, as we said earlier, he couldn't accept what his eyes are telling him, and that's part of the phenomenon here. Every visual cue for the driver is suggesting you are going downhill. Trees, surrounding land, the absence of a clear horizon create a false sense of elevation that overwhelms the human intuition. Contextual tilt dominance is the core mechanism behind a gravity hill, and it's less about the road itself than about what surrounds it. Your brain decides what is level by comparing surfaces to the largest, most stable-looking elements in view. Those are going to be hills, trees, fence posts, utility poles, all those things. And that could steer you wrong in extreme cases. It's not very common, of course. People can respond differently to these type of illusions. Like an experienced ranger, surveyor may be less affected if they habitually are looking for objective cues, if they know the area, if they're looking at things like drainage flow. A highly perceptive person may notice inconsistencies like water pooling or the way loose gravel settles. So even in the Pennsylvania example, you have a commenter saying, no, I use chalk markings on the pavement to confirm that the vehicle rolled past a fixed line. And this happened consistently over many trips. This isn't a one-time visit. This isn't a one-time thing. The car was going uphill. And other commenters saying the car's not, it's your perception. And you get into that typical, how can you deny my lived experience, etc. So we're still arguing about gravity hills. Gravity Hill's hit a cultural sweet spot in the 1990s. This is the last of the great era of offline urban legend circulation. Teenagers would still pile into cars at night. Gas was still cheap. The road itself was entertainment. Gravity Hill spread through word of mouth. Photocopied weird places lists, local newspaper oddity columns, all the things you had before the internet. And then when the internet starts, those early internet pages, which couldn't be more than just textual lists, very often were. All you had to do was sit in the car and watch it roll, and you could still get someone to do that in the 1990s. There was no competition from smartphones or a more technologically advanced web. I feel bad, and I felt worse. I'm a creep, yeah. I'm a jerk. Come on. Touch me, I'm sick. Wow, I won't live long, and I'm full of rot. Gonna give you, girl, everything I've got. Touch me, I'm sick. Yeah, touch me, I'm sick. Not exactly happy lyrics. And for the late 1980s in Seattle, Washington, that is exactly the point. We're getting away from that materialist 80s, that big time, that Madonna, the colors, the size, and getting into something smaller, something more punky without being total skinhead punk. Seattle in the 1990s was widely seen as a loose, informal place, different. Somebody makes a comment, and you know, there's a lot of stories about it. I'm just going to go with the party line of Mark Arm from the band Mudhoney, whose lyrics I just quoted. He describes his own band's sound as sounding like dirt, S-H-I-T, and grunge. And that last word sticks. It starts bringing new people to the town of Seattle to pursue the kind of music they want, a kind of raw energy, not spending a lot of money on it. Something Mudhoney would describe in another song called Everybody Loves Our Town, a very sarcastic song about how much people are coming to the town and love the town. And of course, the big moment is 1991. When Smells Like Teen Spirit, not exactly like a happy title there, hits the whole national scene and explodes on the charts. Top 40 radio, record sales. Now everybody's looking to Seattle, and they're looking at bands. But all along, there's been a band with a kind of raw energy and a female lead singer who's attracting quite a bit of attention. Would be good if you could just leave me well enough alone. To hear it told by certain record executives and by band members, the next band that was about to hit, say 1993, was going to be the Gits. And they were going to display the real Seattle, like the real energy of a rock club, mixed with the fact that the lead singer, Mia Zapata, had this kind of vocal energy and could shift from, vulnerability to real rock and sound. Copyright and stuff, we're not allowed to really play music on podcasts. She's raised in Kentucky by parents who worked in television. She goes to Antioch College in Ohio, and her bandmates just want to get out of Ohio. They start hearing things in the 80s about it's cool to go to Seattle. Go there, play the music you want to play, different from the music that's being played on the radio. And unlike, say, a Pearl Jam, they do not sound like Pearl Jam. They're a little bit closer to the punk side of grunge, let's say. Jagged guitars, fast tempo. She's got a forceful voice, but again, it's a voice that if you listen to this song, Another Shot of Whiskey, you hear this vulnerability. And I think the one that took this banner, at least to the national music circuit, is Courtney Love. But I listen to Mia Zapata, and I think a lot of people felt there's no quite comparison. She was known less as a star, more as a presence. She's at everybody's gigs. She's constantly at the Comet Bar. She lives nearby, regular at shows. She's helping to promote other bands. people loved her. They just said that she was able to encourage other band members and things like that. According to the drummer of this band, Stephen Moriarty, they were a few days from getting a large record contract and going on a national tour. July 1993, she leaves the Comet Bar, listening to bands. People see her and just talk with her.
Around 2 a.m., Mia Zapata left a friend's apartment. An hour later, her body was found 2 miles away, reportedly laying face up in an almost Christ-like pose. Mia had been beaten and strangled.
This is a shock to the Seattle community. They're just, even though it's a place that has an edge where people are playing music that's like violent in a way and raw, it is, the people aren't like that, you know, and it's a scene where people are friends and no one knows what to think. Music has to come from what hurts. It has to come from what matters. What was hurting people in Seattle in this music scene is the loss of Mia Zapata. And I'm going to tell you, in that city, the loss of Kurt Cobain a year later, which happens and makes national news, and certainly people were sad about, Mia Zapata was a bigger event among the Seattle community. I could make that argument, reinforced by some books on the history of grunge that I've read. Everybody Loves Our Town by Mark Yarm, not to be confused with Mark Arm. He talks about this as being the most intense event that happens. And the real, not only is it a shattering of this peaceful music community that they felt that they had, it forces people in the music scene who weren't used to going to authorities to have to go to the authorities. We were all very tough people, says rocker Kristen Storm. And as a group of women, we're all really strong. We were outspoken. We were hard-hitting. We're very opinionated. We had a perception of we're not victims at all in any way, and this can't happen to us. And Zapata's death shattered that myth. The case goes cold, and Nirvana, Soundgarden, the Gits, everyone gets together to raise money to hire a private investigator. The case is on Unsolved Mysteries, Mia Zapata's case.
She was sensuous, charismatic, and talented. One of the bright lights of Seattle's rock music scene.
She said she used taxis, knew many drivers. Maybe there was an encounter with a cab driver. She may have walked towards a friend's nearby apartment, passing a reservoir, because a resident there reported hearing a terrifying scream coming from the reservoir. The organizations raised money to hire private investigator Leigh Heron. And Heron believes that this is not a random attack, even though the police say, look, Seattle's just not as safe as you guys think it is. This was random. This was somebody on the street.
The police believe it was a random murder. Investigator Leigh Heron believes otherwise. She is convinced that Mia knew her killer, and that the killer may not have acted alone.
I think it's entirely likely that a second person was involved in transporting Mia's body, if not in the actual homicide. I base this on the fact that Mia's body was found with her arms out and her legs crossed, as if two people had been carrying her and laid her down. Also, she had been beaten in the course of her attack, but her face was not touched. And I believe that this is more the modus operandi of somebody who knows a person and does not want to attack their face, but attacks their body.
With the passion of life I have left, I'm going to use it to sacrifice myself.
In this music community, now people are thinking one of their own may have did this, because Mia was very connected. Now, what ends up happening is by the time you get to 2003, there is DNA. DNA was collected during the time of the crime, but the databases weren't yet available. And they start running in a database. At first, they get no hits. And then eventually, Jesus Mezquia, who had no connection to the Seattle music scene, no connection to Zapata, they get a hit on his DNA because he's down in Florida. There are charges against him for virtually every ex-girlfriend he has, and his current wife report him to the police for being violent. He used to live in the Seattle area. The DNA matches evidence preserved from Zapata's body they have their first link. He does not confess. He maintains his innocence. But with this forensic DNA evidence, they're able to convict him, and he's sentenced to 36 years in prison. He has since passed away. Finding the killer wasn't cathartic. I thought it would be, said Moriarty, the drummer for the Gits. I counted on it being cathartic. I didn't think it would happen for years. I think the story is important for two issues that you had. One is the kind of budding true crime and talk, and you had shows like America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries on, and were very popular. And how far were they really getting to the truth of cases versus actual police investigations? You had, again, the PI that sort of created a lot of discussion in the Seattle community, only to see that eventually it would come to nothing. You also had a form of music that isn't a popular form of music now. It probably could come back at some point. And a band that never was, that actually has some pretty good music. You can listen to them on YouTube. The conspiracy theory of society comes from abandoning God and then asking, who is in his place? This is a quote from Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies. September 17th, 1994, Sir Karl Popper dies at the age of 92 in London. He was one of the 20th century's most influential philosophers of science and political thought. His idea of historicism, as he used the term, others use this differently, was the belief that history unfolds according to discoverable, deterministic laws, and that by understanding those laws one can predict and shape the future. Popper argues that such claims of historicism were not only scientifically unfounded but politically dangerous. Attempts to impose grand scientific blueprints for society lead to authoritarianism, and they justify suppressing dissent in the name of a supposedly inevitable historical destiny. One could argue we could use a Popper today, because the rhetoric you hear operates in anti-rational ways. Rather than making claims that can be tested, corrected, or abandoned, many assertions made today are framed so they are immune to refutation. When the evidence is contradicting, the response is not revision, but legitimizing the criticism. The data are fake, the institutions corrupt, the experts politically motivated. For Popper, this is the defining move of pseudoscience and dogmatic ideology, systems of belief that survive only by attacking the very standards that could evaluate them. He was sharply critical of conspiracy thinking in his time. Conspiratorial narratives explain too much while proving nothing. Every counterexample becomes further proof of the conspiracy's depth. Popper's defense of the open society directly anticipates the danger of sustained attacks on science and democracy. An open society depends on fallibility, the willingness to admit error and revise beliefs. You lose that, you lose everything. When leaders frame uncertainty as weakness and criticism as treason, they push society towards what Popper called historicism and authoritarian closure. It would be easy to explain the politics of Japan after World War II, and it's simply that one party keeps winning. The Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, governs from 1955 to 1993. There are opposition parties, but these parties are kind of seen as a joke. They're ridiculed as yato, just fragmented parties that barely compete, get a very small percentage of the vote, maybe win in some local areas. It's always the LDP that wins the elections, until 1994. And then there's a political earthquake, because things are changing. In the late 1980s, the 1990s, the Japanese system's under strain, and most importantly, the collapse of the Japanese economic miracle that had taken place from the 60s into the 80s. And you get to 1989 and 1990, 1991. And 1991 going into 1992 is the first year that you actually see no GDP growth in Japan. Now, anyone that was around for the 1980s, that's crazy because all you heard about in the United States was how great Japan was doing, how much of our stuff they were buying. There were a lot of executives here. They were buying American companies, American real estate, but it slows. And oddly enough, Japan's recession, 94, 95, 96, 97, and going to real negative growth in 1998 happens just as the United States is starting to boom economically. And let me tell you, the people, as you can imagine, are not happy. There's also scandals in the LDP. There's structural corruption, jobs for money. And within the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, there's actually always been these factions, the Habatsu, who act like parties within the party, and they're determining who's going to be in the cabinet, who's going to control, which policies are going to pass. So with them fighting among themselves, you have in 1993 the first opening when one of the factions in the LDP grabs power and institutes reforms so that the other factions within the LDP don't always win the elections. Of course, in 1994, you have Tamichi Moriyama wins the election. He is from the Japanese Socialist Party. This would have seemed unthinkable just a few years earlier. The JSP was a protest party, anti-militarist, skeptical of the security arrangement between the U.S. and Japan. And now its leader is leading the country. It feels like a political earthquake, and it is. But something's going on behind the scenes, disguised by the personality or lack of personality in Tamichi Moriyama. I know this is a generalization, but think of him a bit as Japan's Jimmy Carter. There's even talk of him wearing sweaters and things like that. Has an accent from the Kansai, which is the west of Japan. He talks a little bit slower. He talks in a less powerful way. He's cautious. Something's going on behind the scenes. When the LDP loses power in 1993, the LDP never really loses power. And so when the coalition comes in 1994, LDP decides to choose survival and to kind of go into the wave, to ride the wave, and they back Moriyama in order to block newer reform parties or prevent a deeper rewriting of Japan's political system. Here's the one thing they know about this Yato party, and they can do business with him. They know that the party has been long established, even if it's always been the loser in elections. It's interesting to hear of the Japanese Socialist Party, and that might be shocking that the word socialism's in there. It always is, right? Especially when I'm an American and I'm doing essentially an American podcast from the United States where the word socialist is charged. It's not like some people don't embrace it. Your Madamis, your Bernie Sanders, your AOCs. But for observers in the U.S. or in Britain, looking at it in 1994, Japan already looked social democratic. It's a powerful bureaucracy, industrial policy, heavy regulations, a high spending, to this day still high spending healthcare system, extensive state coordination of the economy. So Murayama is not really introducing some radical new equation. It's not like Japan suddenly turned socialist, but the party long defined by opposition to the U.S. security alliance now holds the top office. But here, there's also a step. If the LDP takes a step towards the socialists, Moriyama, maybe not so much his party, takes a step towards the LDP in terms of this U.S. security alliance. He moderates his stance. He affirms that he's not going to make a change for national security reasons, whatever his personal preferences or the preferences of his party. The LDP, meanwhile, retains influence behind the scenes over key ministries and budgets. So while they've got this figure leading and see new change, Murayama, they take the finance ministry, the construction ministry, the international trade and industry, and agriculture ministries. These are all the ministries that shape budgets, industrial policy, public works, rural subsidies. These are things that are going to help the LDP still remain in charge even while they're out of power. Now, this coalition is not going to last long. It's only going to last about 2 years. And indeed, the LDP will run Japan. They run Japan today. There's a new prime minister, the first female prime minister, who is LDP. There was a little interruption again during a recession, 2008, when the JDP, the Japanese Democratic Party, one of these new parties established during the prime minister from that, was elected. Generally speaking, the LDP wins, and they win again in 1996. Basically, by having this Murayama government, this fractured coalition, they were able to show, see, you don't want change. We understand you were mad at us in the early 90s. We're the LDP. We'll get things running again. They still had a big base all over the country of Japan, particularly in rural areas. The LDP is very strong. It's one of the reasons they wanted that agriculture department. And so Murayama is voted out of office, and up until his death, he is someone who's sought out by other countries. And there's a reason for that, because he makes the famous Murayama statement. August 15th, 1995. This is the 50th anniversary of Japan's surrender in World War II. And he does something politically difficult in Japan, but for national security reasons and for international relations reasons, very important. Murayama states that Japan, through its colonial rule and aggression, had caused tremendous damage and suffering to the people of many countries, especially in Asia. He expresses deep remorse, heartfelt apology. These are crucial phrases that other countries are going to note. Because earlier Japanese statements had been made, and there's been a few statements since then, but they've all been vaguer, and they've failed to acknowledge clear responsibility for aggression or for colonialism. Murayama pushes this language. It's not something that he's unwilling to do. Now, normally the LDP, if they were in power, this wouldn't be something that they would support. But with Murayama in charge, he's able to push it. He does issue it through a different cabinet member, one of the socialist members. That makes it formally adopted by the cabinet, and the statement becomes then the official position of the Japanese government. Not just a personal remark that the prime minister happened to say in a corner, captured by reporters. It's an official statement of the Japanese government. This gives it diplomatic weight. It's welcomed in China and South Korea. There is some skepticism. The language is strong. Japanese actions on textbooks, war shrines, compensation issues sometimes work against this apology. But the Murayama statement does set a reference point. When later prime ministers spoke about the war, they were judged by whether they upheld Murayama's wording. Conservatives argued that Murayama went too far and damaged the national pride of Japan. Progressives and much of the Japanese left argued that was the bare minimum, and you're still cooperating with the U.S. on security agreements, which we don't like. Prime ministers like Koizumi or Abe carefully referenced the statement without restating its language. So prime ministers after Murayama, including the current one, are forced to sort of say, well, that statement is made. Because if they want to change it, the burden is on them to do something really big in order to change the Murayama statement. So they can't do that. But that doesn't necessarily mean they want to repeat. They're willing to just simply point to what Murayama said, official policy of the government, and leave it at that. In a way, if you're into U.S. politics, it kind of reminds me of how Roe v. Wade, a lot of politicians or judges referred to it before it was overturned. Like, well, that's the ruling of the court. And not much more than that. And that's kind of how people in Japan referred to the Murayama statement, including the most recent prime minister. Bill Clinton welcomes the statement as a positive, stabilizing development in East China. He's careful, though, politician that he is, not to gloat, not to push it too hard. He didn't want to be forcing Japan into some kind of apology or exploiting the moment. As recently as December 2025, Prime Minister Takaichi explicitly stated that she views the Murayama Statement and other past cabinet-endorsed historical positions as part of Japan's official historical understanding to be carried forward. Very often, other countries will use the Murayama Statement against Japan in a sense, in some foreign policy dispute. Most recently, China's foreign ministry has referenced the Murayama Statement in response to statements made by the current prime minister about defending Taiwan. They urge Japan, live up to your post-war principles that you stated. Live up to your historical commitments. I think there's two interesting things. One is the statement, but also this idea of what happens when a party gets broken up, splintered. We've seen things like this. There was an Irish election where the two main parties were voted out and were forced into a coalition with each other to survive. You have a possibility in the UK. You even have the possibility in the US. Who knows, how things are going, particularly in a post-Trump era, where people just aren't happy with Democrats and Republicans and GOP and things. So who knows what's going to happen with all of this. But you see how parties are able to kind of shape and employ tactics in order to deal with these insurgent parties. Deep in history in the UK during the 1920s, when the two main parties were liberal and conservative, and they had traded places over the course of the 19th century in the United Kingdom. But when you reach the 1920s, the Labour Party's insurgent, and in the 24 election, there's suddenly Labour has the most votes. So the Liberals go into coalition with them, give them the government, hoping they'll fail. They do fail in many senses and are voted out. But instead of rewarding the Liberals, the Labour essentially takes the Liberals' place. And those are the two parties you have today in the UK. It looked like the Manhattan phone book, one reviewer said. It's bulky, and no one can miss it.
This is so far, it seems as if people think it really is sort of a book about drug addiction and recovery, and intentional fallacies notwithstanding. I mean, what was really going on in my head was something more general.
Making the act of reading Infinite Jest, the act of carrying it around, almost as important as reading it itself, which might have been part of the intention of its author, David Foster Wallace. Certainly the size of the book was exactly his intention. It's over 1,000 pages long, published in 1996, saturated with anxieties about entertainment, addiction, attention, loneliness.
That some of the sadness that it seems to me kind of infuses the culture right now has to do with this loss of a sense of purpose or organizing principles, something you're willing to give yourself away to, basically.
Concerns that would later define the internet age. It's only written at the very beginning. Wallace was writing before smartphones, writing before streaming culture. Yet the novel imagines a society undone by pleasure, so perfectly calibrated that people lose the will to do anything else.
And that the addictive impulse, which is very much kind of in the cultural era right now, is interesting and powerful only because it's a kind of obvious distortion of kind of a religious impulse or an impulse to be part of something bigger.
Wallace was interested in this. He was worried that entertainment was becoming a form of domination rather than relief. The interesting thing about television is that it discourages concentration. The book is famously uncomfortable to read. He resists the idea that fiction should be there to soothe or entertain. The reader should be working. The reader should have confusion, should have boredom. The reader should be frustrated. The reader should have pain. The novel's difficulty, its length, its fractured chronology induce that pain. Its relentless endnotes that you have to read. It forces readers to confront their own impatience and their desire for that easy payoff that they're not going to get in Wallace's hands. The novel's fictional entertainment, so compelling that it paralyzes viewers, prefigures binge-watching, doom-scrolling, algorithmic feeds. Wallace once said, "There are these two young fish swimming along. What the hell is water?" A metaphor often used to explain how invisible environments shape us. What the hell is water? Infinite Jest tries to make that water visible to the fish. July 4th, 1996 isn't that significant, but it was a 4th of July in the middle of the decade, and something happens. And it's called Hotmail. Because email in 1996 was still tethered to where you worked. I know this was true for me initially. You had an email based on where you worked or your internet service provider, and at that time, a lot of it was AOL. So you either had an AOL email or you had an email with your workaddress.com. You were tethered to these institutions. The notion that a person could just carry an address and bring it around with them for life was new in 1996. Everything on Hotmail ran entirely on a web browser. There's no special software, no ISP affiliation. It's an email, and this sounded crazy at the time, that could be accessed from any computer in the world. And in December 1997, Microsoft acquires Hotmail for $400 million. Before the mid-1990s, most doctors thought that with the AIDS epidemic, they were dealing with something like a slow leak on a faucet. Water seeping quietly through a pipe over years. You didn't panic. You put a bucket under it. You patch it cautiously, and you hope to slow the damage. Treatment's conservative, because you don't want to hurt the pipe. In 1996, Time magazine named an unusual person for their Person of the Year. Normally, it's a big political leader or a celebrity, a musician, someone like that. They named David Ho, a doctor. What Dr. Ho does is show that AIDS isn't like that at all. It's not a slow leak. It's a full-scale factory fire, and you have to put it out immediately. It's been raging nonstop since the very day of infection. The immune system wasn't slowly wearing out, as they thought. That's how they thought AIDS would affect the patient, slowly wear the patient's immune system down. The immune system's running at maximum speed just to stay upright, replacing destroyed cells as fast as the virus can wipe them out. His development leads immediately to the drugs known as cocktails or complementary drugs. Because previously, assuming that they thought that AIDS was acting slowly, the idea was do a drug one at a time. And as Dr. Ho found, that's actually deadly for the AIDS virus. Ho notices that when treatment begins, viral levels in the blood are falling dramatically within days. Other doctors were letting them rise up again. But AIDS is driven by constant viral replication. The immune system's locked in a battle. You don't want to partially suppress it. You want to hit the virus from multiple angles at once. You can look at AIDS as a big failure, and a lot of it comes from politics. I think there's been a lot of coverage on some of the prejudices around AIDS and some of the inaction of, say, the Reagan administration, because initially the disease appears to be hitting mostly in the gay community. And 5 years after doctors first recognized AIDS as a distinct illness, not just some type of other illness, 40,000 people in the United States are already dead. Effective treatments are nowhere. So ACT UP, an activist group, is founded in 1987 to confront this failure directly. They're using confrontation, civil disobedience. We talked about the Rose Parade earlier. ACT UP demonstrates how sometimes an activist program is needed to advance things because it reshapes how quickly drug trials were conducted. It forced access to experimental medications that otherwise would have been blocked. It expanded the official definition of AIDS so women could qualify for treatment and benefits. Initially, it was seen as a man's disease. Developments of Dr. Ho, research that he's able to get, and the resulting combination therapy drugs that proved very effective within a year of Dr. Ho's discoveries are directly tied to this activist work. Picture an ad agency in 1992 with cubicles and people wearing suspenders. A "Don't copy that floppy" poster is on the wall, and it's starting to curl. Someone's fax machine is screaming, and over in the corner, an account supervisor named Greg slides a floppy disk into his PC, sees that little red light. Good, this is normal. Everything's being read, completely ordinary. He boots the machine, and suddenly the directory fills with garbage characters on his screen. Files evaporate right in front of him. Greg has no idea, but the office has just tripped the time bomb hidden back in 1991 in a small computer shop in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. A programmer accidentally booted off the wrong floppy disk. That disk already held a new piece of boot sector malware circulating quietly on underground bulletin boards. Once his PC caught the virus, every floppy disk he duplicated for his customers carried a copy of it. That box of disks from the Netherlands eventually crosses the Atlantic and lands on a trade show table in Las Vegas. Unfortunately, this is one of those trade shows where freebies are grabbed by the handful. The time 1992 rolls around, the Michelangelo virus had hopped through offices, schools, and print shops worldwide. People shared disks constantly at this time. They were passing around fonts. They passed around their resumes, their games, small utilities. Every time someone booted from an infected disk, the virus slipped silently into the hard drive and waited. That's what it did. It was waiting because it was programmed to wake up on March 6th, the birthday of Michelangelo, but not everybody's PC was set to the right date. In fact, some offices had clock drift. And on March 5th, the Reuters wire was already beginning to buzz. The Michelangelo computer virus attacked a day early at more than a dozen U.S. companies, turning personal computer data to gibberish. So said the LA Times, March 6, 1992. Hear that date and listen to the description so far of people physically passing disks. Realize we're talking about a period well before phones or anything like that, well before, say, wireless transmission, well before even an internet that would be, let's say, commercially or publicly available to the general public. One by one, phones rang in IT offices in Japan, where March 6th arrived between 14 hours earlier than New York. In Japan, where March 6th arrived 14 hours earlier, they see the first wave. A small engineering firm reportedly lost $20,000 to $30,000 worth of architectural drawings. Argentina's newspaper saw its file gutted, its main newspaper. The Oakland Tribune was hit because Michelangelo piggybacked into a related boot virus that was called Stoned. In California, John McAfee, at time the chairman of the Computer Virus Industry Association, told reporters why it was happening early. People don't ordinarily monitor their computer time like they do their wristwatch. Very 90s comment. In the end, the Michelangelo virus caused more panic than apocalypse. It taught an early lesson. It created the antivirus industry that people like John McAfee and others would profit from. Floppy disks were gateways. Be careful, boot sectors mattered. Quiet little details like system dates could hold enormous power. It also signals a shift. People began scanning disks. Offices started making backups. Reporters suddenly understood what boot sector meant, only to forget it later. Michelangelo became the virus that made the public take computer viruses seriously. Certainly not a problem that we're done with now. It's just being distributed in a different way. And John McAfee would go to make lots of cash in the 1990s. McAfee Associates really would create that first commercial antivirus software. And he was very visible as a spokesperson throughout the 90s. But he makes tens of millions. He has a strange story after this. He lost most of his money in the 2008 financial crisis. He moves to Belize, built a compound, keeps armed guards, became a self-styled security guru, and gave increasingly bizarre interviews.
In 2013, he created a profanity-laced video explaining how users could uninstall his own software.
In 2012, the police in Belize noticed that his neighbor, Gregory Fall, was found murdered.
The year before, McAfee faced criminal accusations while living in Belize. As the story went, his next-door neighbor poisoned his dogs, and McAfee had him killed. But he never faced criminal charges.
And police wish to question McAfee. He flees the country, claiming the government was trying to kill him.
He talked to CNBC's Jane Wells about that in 2015, and it was clear he had issues.
My wife is sort of put out because I'm up and down all night long looking out windows and things. I mean, people do think I'm paranoid, and perhaps that's a paranoid act. If you believe the stories and believe that the Belizean government might actually still be after me, that's a stressful situation.
He wears disguises, he makes paranoid statements, but he's all the while blogging his movements in real time. He moves back to the United States. He runs for president twice. He releases wild YouTube videos. He gives interviews while armed and surrounded by bodyguards. 2020, he's arrested in Spain for tax evasion at the request of the U.S. Department of Justice. And in 2021, while awaiting extradition, McAfee dies in his jail cell. Aliens back Clinton. We had this little mini trend in the 1990s of the aliens getting involved in politics on the World Weekly News. This was a familiar sight in the supermarket stands to see the tabloid headlines featuring extraterrestrials that had that kind of cone head, big-eyed look that you might expect. It would get very little notice, except the aliens, they seemed to change their endorsement of presidential candidates with the fortunes of the 1992 election, which attracted some attention. First, they were backing Ross Perot, who was shooting up in the polls in April 1992, then Bush. And as he united the party after the Democratic convention, the aliens backed Clinton, one more sign of the growing momentum for the Democratic ticket that year. Each was paired with a cheesy photo of the big-eyed alien shaking hands with the candidate of the week, creating a running gag that made it seem as if the same intergalactic kingmaker was quietly pulling the strings of all the U.S. elections. "1990s fake news, but at least back then it was in your face. Go ahead and sue me, you'll lose type journalism. So obviously fake that made it more okay, maybe." When I did come to my senses, they said my temperature was 108.
One after another, the victims of heat exhaustion have been wheeled into Jackson Park Hospital.
She was unresponsive, unconscious, very hot.
It's been non-stop for paramedics and police.
I mean, it's not just the old, it's the young as well.
Chicago's not a tropical town now, nor was it in the 1990s, and yet summers there can get beachy. It does have that lake, it does have beaches, and the city's famed wind would have you thinking that it will never get so bad in terms of heat in the city proper. But this really isn't true. In fact, there was a threat that caught city officials by surprise in 1995.
Heat indexes over 100 degrees kept a hold on the city for 5 straight days.
Chicago found itself in the grip of a heat wave so intense it seemed to smother the city. It starts with 2 days, July 13th and 14th, and what is really a dome of very hot, moisture-laden air, pushing the heat index values above 115 degrees, even after sunset. The thick, humid air remains in the streets. The city's brick, asphalt, and concrete, soaked with daytime heat, kept nighttime readings feeling like triple digits. This really hits the city's elderly and the city's poor, many living in small apartments, some with little or no air conditioning. Sometimes, to be safe, windows are shut tight. Fans do little more than stirring this heavy air. The first people to take notice of this are the ambulance drivers. They're going from call to call with no stop. Then the hospitals notice they're overflowing with people with heat stroke, and morgues begin to reach capacity.
We're really facing a heat-related disaster here.
On an average night back then, the morgue received 17 bodies. In the midst of the heat wave, a staggering 87 people died in just one day.
Authorities open cooling centers, urge residents to check on neighbors, but never takes the kind of dramatic step to really combat this problem, because they really didn't see it. By the time the worst had passed, more than 500 Chicagoans were dead, and the disaster stood as one of the starkest reminders of how urban infrastructure, poverty, isolation, and lack of coordination can turn extreme weather into a public health catastrophe. Mayor Richard Daley is criticized. This is the son of the famous mayor from the 60s. He's criticized for treating the conditions as unpleasant but ordinary.
The city of Chicago had a heat emergency plan on the books that summer, and they didn't even use it.
But here's Eric Klinenberg in Heat Wave, Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago. When hundreds of people die slowly, alone and at home, unprotected by friends and family, and unassisted by the state, it is a sign of social breakdown in which communities, neighborhoods, and networks, governmental agencies, and the media were all implicated.
They forgot that they had it.
73% of the heat-related deaths were residents over the age of 65. More than half lived on the west and south side of the city.
The mayor was on vacation. The health department commissioner was on vacation. The fire department commissioner, who manages paramedics, on vacation. So the B team was running the city of Chicago.
He makes quotes to this effect. Many victims were elderly, lived alone, and lacked air conditioning. Somewhere around 1991, somebody, somewhere, got the first 404 error, meaning the site they wanted to look at wasn't there. So the browser they're using returned 404 error. Most likely it was at the original site to the World Wide Web at CERN with Tim Berners-Lee. August 6, 1991, Tim Berners-Lee posted an announcement to the alt.hypertext newsgroup, inviting people outside CERN to try the World Wide Web, to download a browser program, and to set up their own servers. This is generally considered the moment that the web was first seen by the wider world. Before that, there was already an internet, of course, dominated by email, FTP, Usenet, text-based systems, but it was different. There was a lot of words. It spread more noticeably in 1992 and exploded in 1993 when the Mosaic graphical browser was released. So, most likely the first 404 era occurs at CERN with people using the internet. 404 is not a mistake. It's the browser and the web functioning just the way it's intended. There are also other codes that aren't as well known. 401, unauthorized, means the resource exists, but you need authentication. 403, forbidden, means the server knows who you are and thus refuses access. Interesting, right? These distinctions matter to early web designers because they allowed browsers and automated systems to respond differently. There's also a 402, which means you can see the site, but payment is required. It was defined, but you probably not see a 402 because it's never really been used. It was made to anticipate a future web with built-in micropayments. There was a popular story that emerges that 404 comes from a room at CERN, room 404, and that was a physical office where missing files were stored. Cool story, bro, but almost certainly a myth. The numbers were chosen to fit a logical scheme, not a building map,